Interop 2020, and in particular, welcome to the Automation Summit hosted by Network to Code. My name is Claudia, and I want to thank you for spending the next 30 minutes getting to know pyATs with me. Before we dive into pyATs, there are two sessions I wanted to highlight for you. The first, ironically, right before this one, from Dr. Xenia Montrado, testing your Python code. That's relevant and ironic for two reasons. The first is that this is something that I think we all tend to shy away from, and by we, I mean network engineers. It smacks a little bit too much of actual application or software development, I think. But it's something that we really do need to start paying attention to. So if you missed her session, I hope that you can circle back around to it. It is an important thing to at least start looking at. The other one is a session by Mikhail introducing Batfish to you. Batfish lets you kind of analyze changes that you want to introduce into your network, and just to make sure that the right things are going to happen. And so I mentioned that because if you think about all the things that we do as network engineers, we figure out that we have to introduce a change into our network. You could use Batfish to snapshot your network and validate that those changes are doing the right things. Then you move into your automation platform, you push out those changes, and then you can use pyATs to validate those changes. That workflow is something that we do every day, and these tools, I think, are going to be important parts of putting together that workflow, eventually putting it into a CI/CD pipeline. Let's get started. pyATs, and again, I highlighted Dr. Montrado's session because I used to think pyATs was all about testing your network automation scripts. It's all about testing your network. So that's why I found it kind of ironic that her session was right before this one. pyATs is, in fact, a test automation and validation framework. It was developed by Cisco and used in-house for a number of years before becoming open source and available to the public. It's free. It's based on Python 3. I think it was made available to us through DevNet like around 2017. So it may be something new to you, but it's been around for a while. So there's certainly a level of maturity there. And that's just the open source version. Of course, it was in use for testing functionality within Cisco for years before that, before being available to us. It can be, I found, a little confusing because if you start Googling pyATs, you'll run into things like Genie and Unicon, and it's like, what are all these things? And there's just too many of them for me to deal with. Well, perhaps in the beginning, but right now everything is being sort of put into the pyATs framework and kind of being merged so that there's a simplistic way that you can interact with the framework. The way I like to think of it is pyATs actually gives you that kind of all the underpinnings, kind of the framework that you put libraries and modules on top of. So pyATs provides that testing support framework, and then Genie is just the main library sitting on top of it that gives you all kinds of good stuff like parsing. Very easy parsing. If you've done a lot of parsing as you get started in network automation, your life's going to get a little simpler right now. As I mentioned, pyATs is not a Python code testing framework like PyTest or Unit Test, although you should look into those. So pyATs is going to help us answer the questions, are my BGP neighbors all still there? What changed from yesterday to today? Diff, basically yesterday's config from today's config, or pre and post change analysis. But this is on your production network. So as we move into, first we started automating configs and gathering show commands, gathering state, then maybe pushing out standard commands. This is the complete package now, right? Start to finish, and the finishing part is testing your network to make sure that the change you introduced to it didn't break anything. My goal in this presentation is not only to show you, get you started with some very basic stuff about pyATs, show you the different ways that you can interact with it. I also want to show you that it does have a variety of different modules, different parsers for different vendors. So while yes, it started out live with Cisco, it is by no means exclusively for Cisco equipment. And what you see here on the side of the slide are just the different vendors that are supported with the Genie parsers. The other thing I wanted to highlight is where to put this in context of some of the other tools that you may have heard of or you may already be working with. Norner, NetMiko, Ansible. There is some overlap, and so one of my goals in this session is to show you perhaps where there is overlap, where there isn't, and where there's some unique features that that you want to look at for pyATs to solve a particular problem that maybe is going to be solved a bit easier with this module than with some of the others. I say module, I mean framework. So we'll get started with simple stuff, and then I do want to highlight the evolution as you start with pyATs. Your problem sets, we'll have different solutions, and pyATs, I think, will help you kind of run through the various gamut of testing of your network. Just a quick little slide. The first column shows you some of the typical things that we do as network engineers, kind of the pyATs solution, either the call or the method that you use, the file, and then the comparable technologies that are out there that you may be using for that particular activity. So we always have to list our network devices. In pyATs, that is called a testbed file. It defines the thing you want to test. It's not your lab, it's not your test lab, it's the test bed, the thing you're testing. It's often a production network. Although as you get started, right, we'll likely use some of the DevNet sandboxes. So yes, that is a lab, but the intent is to actually test your production network. Comparable technologies to that, think of the Ansible host file, the Norner host file. I think of a CSV or a text file full of IPs that you give to NetMiko. If you're perhaps a little bit more advanced, you've got a single source of truth, whether it's ServiceNow, or if you don't have one, I strongly urge you to look at Netbox. But whatever your single source of truth is, probably has an API or some way to dump out your devices, and then you can format that data into your PyYAML test file. Topology is an interesting one. A lot of the tools I've mentioned already, Ansible, Norner, NetMiko, don't really have a concept of what interfaces are talking to what interfaces, unless you kind of build it into your scripts. pyATs actually lets you define topologies links within your testbed file, because part of testing is testing whether did this link come up, is this link up? So that's a unique feature. If that's a requirement that you have for some activity that you're doing where you are testing connectivity, that's something that you might want to look to pyATs for. Then back to kind of what we normally do, we establish a connection. pyATs has a couple of ways. The device connect method is the primary method, but another unique thing with pyATs is that you can actually ask it to figure out what type of device it is, what OS it's running. You can actually also ask it to figure out what the device host name is. If you've ever had to parse out host names from different types of network equipment, it can be time consuming and and not a little daunting, just because you're literally parsing different formats from different file structures. So very, very nice feature, could save you a lot of coding. And of course, it speaks to that chicken and egg problem, right? You have to put together a testbed file defining all your devices and how to talk to them. But what if you don't have that just yet? So very, very intriguing, new, relatively new feature with pyATs. I encourage you to look at that. Of course, the next step, once we've logged into a device, is to execute commands, whether they're show commands, and that's usually when someone is starting out. I suggest you start out with just pulling show commands, right? Very low risk, non-intrusive, and then move into pushing out configuration. But in this case, we've got two options with pyATs. You can do device execute, which just gives you the raw response, just as though you were logged in and running the show commands yourself through the device's CLI. Device parse is one of these unique capabilities. It's not entirely unique in that you can do similar things with NetMiko, Napalm, and that's just the parsing component of those commands. Because while if you're reading the output that you know what to do with the data, your script may not. And so you have to get that data into something that can be digested by your script. So parsing is huge. And if you've looked at modules like TextFSM, you understand what I'm talking about, right? And the challenges oftentimes with parsing, because the next version of iOS slightly changes format of the output, and now you're in the business of continually updating these parsers. So that is a huge time saver, and really one of the features that I recommend using when you're starting out learning pyATs. Talked about comparing before and after, before change, after change, and that's built into the test framework with pyATs diff. Sometimes you'll see the same command with Genie diff again. As the framework matures, you're going to see kind of a simplification. But right now, you're still able to run kind of the same command through Genie or through pyATs. So don't worry about it too much. Help with these commands is going to be your friend, just like it is in the Cisco CLI. And then this is another unique point: learning the state of a device. So pyATs learn. That's really powerful because it's going to go through and it's going to kind of try to understand, and pull the information of the state of your device and give it to you in structured data. Again, something that your scripts can now deal with. So that is something else. Once you get comfortable with dumping show commands, and in fact, learn may actually skip that step for you, because the things that the pyATs learn command goes out and gets may be just exactly what you need. So let's get started with installing pyATs. So first and foremost, I do want to highlight pyATs works beautifully on Linux and Macintosh. I'm on a Mac now. Not so great with native Windows. You should get the Windows, you will need to get actually the Windows subsystem for Linux. And then all the commands that I'll highlight here will work with any operating system. You're going to want to get WSL anyway. It's just so much nicer to work with that when you're in Windows. So, big important point here: get used to using virtual environments. You probably have heard it in any Python course you've taken. Bite the bullet and just every time you're starting something new, spin up a virtual environment for it. You will regret not doing it, and your life will be so much easier if you just build that muscle memory, get started with that. So what I'm doing here in the first three commands is exactly that. With Python 3, it's a breeze. Just remember Python 3-m venv. Give it the name of the virtual environment. I usually make that name match my repository, so there's no ambiguity, or match the module that it's focused on. Because sometimes I will use the same virtual environment across a couple of different repositories. It's probably bad, but you have that option. So I'm building the virtual environment. It's got the same name as the companion repository to the session. I'm moving into that directory. When you execute the first command, the Python 3-m, it'll build a subdirectory with that name. cd into it, change directory into that, and then basically invoke the virtual environment. You do that with a source. You give it the path, bin, and actually it should have activate here. You'll see right away that you'll get the virtual environment in parentheses here. That means you're in that virtual environment now. So the next thing to do is to install pyATs. So pip install is your friend. Now, a word about installing pyATs. We talked about the different modules. Well, just go ahead and install all of them. You could install bits and pieces if you knew exactly what you wanted. At this point, I just recommend installing the full set of packages. If you're on a Mac and you're using Z Shell, you may want to quote pyATs, open bracket, open square bracket full, close square bracket, and all the other OSs. The command works just the way I have it here. Then, if you're moving into an environment where maybe you don't know what version of pyATs is there, you definitely want to check. There is the pyATs version command. Later versions of pyATs support pyATs version check. And the way to upgrade your pyATs installation is another pip install -- upgrade. And newer versions of pyATs actually will upgrade themselves, if you will, using the pyATs version update command. If you do pyATs --h, you can see all of those commands, and we'll do that here in a minute. The next step, now that you have pyATs installed, is that testbed file I talked about, the description of the network that you want to test. It's a YAML file, the very specific format, and luckily, don't be discouraged by that. There are some very easy ways to generate it. The first is through like an interactive questionnaire. It'll walk you through. It's actually quite nice if you want to never put your passwords, your credentials in the file, then it's set up so that if you leave things blank, it'll actually query you when you basically run a test. Or you can bake the credentials here, as you see in this example file. My recommendation is just start getting very comfortable using environment variables. They will serve you well in any number of things that you do throughout your automation career. So we've got the interactive questionnaire, very easy to do, spits out a file that you can use right away. You can also take a CSV or an Excel file and convert it to a YAML file. And in the companion repository, there's an example of a basic Excel file. And again, I mentioned this before, if you have a single source of truth and you can, through its API or whatever mechanism you have, pull out the topology that you want to test, and you'll have to format it into the right file. There's some other options as well, maybe leveraging some other host files, but there are many ways to get you a fully functional testbed file. For getting started, I do like the questionnaire. And the final note, another one of the unique features about pyATs is that you can describe the links. And we touched on that before. Here's an example from another excellent NetDevOps live session, the link to which is here. So not only do you get your devices enumerated, but your links as well, or as many as you need for the test that you need to do. Okay, executing pyATs also has a variety of different ways to access it. You can do the CLI, or you'll see that called the shell, the pyATs shell. So if you don't ever want to code at all, that's one of the things that you can use to get started. You can use a Python script, of course, and that's kind of always my preference. You can do anything you can do in Python. You'll be able to do. And then there is, if you're more comfortable working with a GUI, there is a web dashboard called Espresso that's available to you. I sort of think of that as, sort of Ansible Tower-ish kind of thing for pyATs. So you've got a shell, you can embed all of this into your Python scripts, and there's even a web UI that you can use. The quick demo I'll do here will focus on the pyATs commands of the shell, but the repository, the companion repository, is all about using pyATs in Python. And before we get into the demo, there's so much more with pyATs. Think about how you would test if you could test easily, if how you were testing inherently had documentation into it. Wouldn't you test more? And wouldn't your network benefit from all of that additional testing? If it was so easy, if it was effortless for you to do, pyATs puts us in a position to do that. Jobs, actually, think of jobs as putting together a sequence of tests to fully test out whatever it is whatever change you've introduced into the network. And then the other thing that I find really, really exciting is that pyATs can integrate the robot framework. Robot is a way to write your test plans in kind of a simple English-like manner. The example here is straight from the robot framework documentation. You can see that it's just a test case for a valid login. And this is very readable, I believe, right? Open the browser to the login page, enter these credentials, submit the credentials, the welcome page should come up. Close the browser. Successful test, not successful test, but this essentially means you never have to write another test plan in Word again. Spend a lot of time trying to figure out how not to use Word and how not to use Visio, to be quite honest with you. All right, let's take a quick look at our demo. All right, so what I have here, first thing, I like to use Docker. So if I go in and do Docker run, give me an interactive terminal, and you give it the Docker image, this will spin up a Docker container, and you can do whatever you want, and you can just trash it when you're done. The DevNet folks have a very nice Docker container. I tend to do a lot with Docker containers, so I have my own series of containers containing different Ansible versions, and that's what I'm using here. You notice that my prompt changed. So I'm basically in my Docker container now. If I do pyATs version, it'll go through. If I spell it right. And you can see that here I'm running version 19.12, which is a bit too old. So I'm going to go ahead and execute the pip install upgrade command we talked about earlier. And while it does that, I've got another container here that I've started out with. I want to show you the learn command, which is incredibly powerful. And we're going to just learn VLAN on a testbed file that has just 2 of my switches in my lab. The companion repository does have a lot of testbed information, including a testbed file just using sandbox devices, DevNet sandbox devices, so that you can kind of hit the ground running. So the first thing we're going to do, I want to highlight that I have exported 2 environment variables, net user and net password. Let's make sure they're still there. So we'll do echo, and they are still defined in the environment. Just to be sure, we'll do password. Okay, and then I've already done the VLAN before. So I'm going to do pyATs learn. I just want to learn about the VLANs. Use this test bed, so it's a couple of switches that I have in my lab, and I will output to this directory. And the directory doesn't have to exist. It'll create it if it's not there. So we're going to do VLAN after. And then we're going to compare. Now, this particular testbed file, for this switch, it asks you to enter. I mentioned that you can define the testbed file so that it can be interactive or look at environment variables, and you'll have this all available to you in the companion repository. So you can see that it went through, it pulled the information, it tells us where it put it. So the ops structure is actually the structured data that we get back, and the device console is the text that you're used to seeing if you were on the CLI of the device yourself. That's the text that you'd see back. Let's take a look at the difference before I made some changes and after I made some changes to those switches. So now we're going to use pyATs diff. If I can copy and paste properly. And it is essentially comparing the data in the VLAN before and the data in the VLAN after. And let's make this a bit bigger. You can see that there is a difference on this Salib switch 5, and we can find it here. I'm just going to display or cat that file, and you can see that VLAN 33 has been added and VLAN 77 has been added. Incredibly powerful. 3 commands, before, after, diff. And there's quite a lot more that can be done, but that's all that I've got time for. The companion repository README is going to have a lot more detail for you if you're interested in getting started. Again, it will use to start you off with a lot of the DevNet sandbox devices, so you don't even need to have a lab to start executing some of these. And I put together some repositories from people who've been at this far longer than I have. Really good stuff here, and also some handy links for you. So I mentioned the pyATs Docker file, the Ansible and Python platform that I like to use. You've got links for both of those, as well as some of the documentation, a list of all the parsers. So plenty of stuff to keep you out of trouble. Thank you very much.